Hey, Roguelike Celebration. I hope you're all having a great time. This is Bruno Dias. I'm a game developer, writer, and theorist based out of São Paulo, Brazil. This video presentation is about procedurally generating prose for Voyageur, my upcoming game. I'm coming to you through video as a way of circumventing region restrictions. Voyageur is a literary space exploration RPG set in a procedural galaxy. Literary, the game communicates mostly through prose. It's a text game in the interactive fiction tradition. Space exploration, it's a space-traveling story in the tradition of science fiction games like Elite. But it takes a very different gameplay approach to those ideas, some of which is based on my own frustrations with the space sim genre. RPG, you play the role of a character that develops over the course of the story. Voyageur has a very simple and straightforward role-playing game model. It's not an involved, complex system of stats and abilities like you might find in some roguelikes. But it's a game about playing a role and developing your character over the course of your travels. Procedural. The places and things you encounter are procedurally generated. A lot of the prose you encounter is procedurally generated too, and I'll be talking at length about how that works. So the planets you visit in your game are unique to your game. They're assembled from different possible elements by the game as you visit them. And, of course, I have to caveat that it's not a roguelike. It's roguelike adjacent. There's procedural generation, there's RPG elements, and there's even a sort of cyclical endgame, like the one in roguelites, like Rogue Legacy. But there's no permadeath, and the difficulty is calibrated to be fairly gentle. At this point, I'm required to let you all know that Voyageur is coming out on iOS and Android sometime in the next 3 months, and that it is being made with funding from Failbetter Games' Fundbetter initiative. Mostly, this video is about how procedural generation works in Voyageur, and how that can be applied to other roguelikes. It's about a series of techniques that I've put together to generate places and descriptions in ways that are meant to surprise and delight players. So to start with, let me pull a planet description directly from the game. This planet's port is a bustling city, buried under the noise of transit. An improvised installation commemorating the establishment of the Santiago Confederation stands at the center of this inhabited area. You pass by an orange cupola fronted with tall windows that let in the sunlight. Soft chanting comes from inside it. Bounding, loud music emanates from somewhere distant, and you are sure some in the colorful crowd are nodding along to it. This is the first description that came out when I was writing this, and you can probably see the seams. So here it is with the component parts highlighted so you can actually see them in detail. You can see that the approach I'm taking is actually pretty coarse. The descriptions are constructed mostly from sentences, but the sentences can contain inner variations. This is an approach based mostly on assembling chunks of authored content into surprising combinations, which is different from the way most procedural generation is done. Usually you're trying to work purely in terms of rules and procedures, which works well for generating levels or terrain, but prose is different. Prose is different because it's complicated and hard to stylize. When we procedurally generate terrain in a game, we're usually not concerned with having a perfect level of detail. You can reduce things down to stylized representations of stuff, like 1 by 1 by 1 meter blocks, and that simpler model of reality lets you operate with simpler rules. With prose, it's hard to find those simplifications, and it's hard to find straightforward rules. Language is something you can't really simplify. Because if you give people a simpler, gentler version of terrain made out of 1 cubic meter blocks, they think that's cute and gentle and fun, and if you give them a simpler, gentler version of language, they think you're talking down to them. So the normal simplifying approach to procedural generation won't work very well for prose generation. What then? Well, there are 3 approaches that have historically been taken. The first approach says, okay, we can sit down and write software that contains all the rules about how language works, because we don't even understand how language works. So you use machine learning as a way of making software that behaves as though it understands those rules without having to explicitly tell it what those rules are. This is a very fertile field being mostly worked on by people who are about 10 times smarter than I am. It's resource intensive, it's complicated, and it's very hard to exert authority or control. So, it's mostly in the realm of experiment and research for now, but I think we will eventually start to see real games that use those kinds of approaches as they get more accessible, as they get more distributed. The second approach is throwing up your hands and not using prose, or using it in very limited and regimented ways. You won't end up with content that's interesting to read of its own accord, but you will end up with content that straightforwardly communicates a world model, and you try to make the world model as interesting as possible. This is basically the approach that Dwarf Fortress uses. There's a lot of textual descriptions of things in Dwarf Fortress, but they all fit basically the same format, and they're all very matter-of-fact. But they can be surprising or even poignant because of their content, which is drawn from a really rich world model. In this approach, your world model is really the star of the show. The complexity and depth of simulation is what you're showcasing, and text is just a cheap way of making the player understand what's going on. The third approach, and the one that I'm taking, is the assemblage method. This is a way of doing things that's very pragmatic. It's really designed to be something that I can use in a game and actually ship it in a reasonable time frame. What I mean by assemblage is building text out of relatively large, human-written chunks, mostly sentences. In Voyageur, I use something similar to Kate Compton's tracery, which some of you are probably familiar with. Tracery is a text expansion library based on a simple generative grammar. So the simplest way to generate text is to start with a list of phrases and pick one. Tracery is a recursive version of that. The phrases that you can choose contain symbols that reference other phrases. That's a really powerful model for generating text. You start from the outside, maybe by picking a paragraph structure. Then you pick appropriate sentence structures to fill in that paragraph, and then you pick specific words to use in those sentences. Most of the text content in Voyageur is not variable down to the word level. Mostly, the generators are working by assembling sentences together. But I'm also going further than you can go with just tracery. Voyageur is filtering the phrases that it can choose based on a model of what it's describing. That itself is an approach that Emily Short came up with to write a procedural novel called The Annals of the Parrigues. In Short's system, the text generator would essentially make statements about what it was describing as it went along, and it would stick to those statements and try to pick other statements that would be a good fit for the model it was developing. So as it generated text, the generator would also create an internal model of the place it was describing, and that model would gradually become more detailed. Voyageur uses a similar approach. First, the generator picks some baseline facts about the planet. Some of those are inherited from the region of space the planet is in, some of them were chosen at random. Then it generates text, picking phrases and words based on a somewhat complex set of priority rules. For instance, the generator is trying to pick phrases that bring up aspects of the model that haven't been brought up yet, or that highlight a focal aspect of it that was selected at random when the generator started. An important step in making those planets thematically consistent is using a symbolic system. There are 6 distinct ideological and aesthetical alignments in Voyageur that permeate a lot of the content: chrysalis, hammer, star, dome, and ladder. There's a couple of consequences to this approach. The first is that there's a large but by no means gigantic number of possible planets. If we cull it down to the 6 most important factors: class, alignment, state and shape of the economy, whether or not it's a frontier world, what special features it has, there's about 10,000 possible worlds, give or take a couple thousand. But the text generator will make even supposedly identical planets distinct from each other. A star-aligned city world might be a foreboding, rainy, gothic metropolis, or it might be this really utopian place. The text in Voyageur isn't a straightforward description of a game model. It's a lens through which the player can look at the world model, and it picks a different angle each time. Kate Compton has talked a lot about the problem of perceptual difference in BCG. The issue is that you can end up with something that looks like 10,000 bowls of oatmeal. Each one's oats are uniquely arranged, but they're all still indistinguishable. But text is really great at creating perceptual difference because it's so expressive and so easy to recombine. Voyageur is full of little miniature text generators that are used to create background detail. An example is a generator that creates weird futuristic fusion food for city worlds. It outputs stuff like miso squash kebab, sauteed stuffed octopus fritters, or aerated kimchi thyme kibbeh. I liked that one so much I made it into a Twitter bot. The text generator is working from a pretty simple corpus of words, but it's still generating very distinctive and sometimes evocative things, which act as a tiny detail to help paint a picture of what a planet or a culture is like. Sometimes you get something really simple and honest, and sometimes you get something really elaborate. And while they are clearly the output of PCG, they're definitely distinctive from each other. So what I'm hoping to accomplish with Voyageur is that by recombining chunks of authored content and using text, I'm not hoping to get PCG that has infinite longevity or can keep surprising players forever. I'm hoping to get PCG that gives players a weird, unique universe that's made out of tiny, digestible glimpses. And I'm hoping that each planet has something to latch onto, a detail you haven't seen it yet. Some kind of fashion or architecture or society or biology that is specific to that planet, at least as much as your experience is concerned. This is actually really labor-intensive on my end. Phrases have to be tagged comprehensively so that they show up in the right places and with the right frequency. And of course, all this content is effectively handwritten. Which gets into another problem with the way we talk about procedural generation in games. Too often, we think of procedural generation as a force multiplier, as a way of getting a lot of content for very little labor. But we know that's not really true. The goal is to create surprise and replayability, to allow players to really go in blind because the game content can't be known beforehand. Roguelikes need this so their die-retry cycle can stay interesting. Voyageur has a similar cycle of game restarting, so procedural generation is a good fit. More than that, though, one thing that always attracted me to space sims was their sense of serendipity. You just set off in a direction and you deal with whatever you found, as you found it. The problem, though, is that traditional space sims don't really encourage that kind of play. They incentivize finding a profitable trade route, or a place where you can pick up good quests, and sticking there. Some of them actively encourage the player to put down roots. In the X series, the games begin as a space sim, but eventually become this sort of management strategy. Eve, of course, is notorious as a spreadsheet simulator. In Voyageur, I wanted to make a game that really was about the unknown thing that was beyond the next jump. It takes a lot after Sunless Sea, which randomizes its map each time so that you only have a vague idea of where to find any given thing. I wanted the sense of slight uncertainty, and I wanted that sense of serendipity that you get from running across just the right thing at the right time in a game you know is randomized. So to get that feeling, I came up with a set of mechanics that work in concert. The first one is procedural generation. The places you visit in the game are all assembled from the game's content as you visit them. This allows for surprise, but it also means that the conceit that you're constantly visiting new places works narratively. If Voyageur was just shuffling pre-generated planets around, players would probably question why they keep seeing the same planet over and over again. So I need to generate new planets all the time to create the illusion of a vast space that they're moving through. The second one is perpetual forward motion. Part of the reason the storytelling in 80 Days works is that you can't revisit places you've been to before. You're constantly picking up new story threads, playing with them for just a bit, and then abandoning them. And it means that procedural planets are actually feasible because no individual planet has the obligation of carrying that much narrative weight. The third mechanic is limited information. Players get an option of a few planets they might visit next, and they're given pretty limited information about those planets, just 1 or 2 facts about them. This encourages players to juggle multiple interests. That increases their chances of seeing a rumor that's relevant to them. None of this would work either without the framework of trait-based narrative. Voyageur, like Fallen London, is made up of individually authored chunks of content that are called storylets. Each storylet is modular. It can give the player choices to follow, which lead into other storylets, but most of the time players are encountering them as options they can pursue while on any given planet. Which storylets you'll see on a planet depend on both the planet itself and the character traits you have accumulated in your story through the game. So that's the basic structure. You have free-floating storylets that are available to the player based on traits. The outcome of entering those starlets is dynamic, sometimes random, and it's often based on the traits themselves, and this outcome is expressed in trait changes. If you find a stowaway in your spaceship, you can blow them out of the airlock, which gives you points in the Ruthless trait and takes away points from the Kind trait. Taking them in and carrying them to their destination will do the opposite. And this will impact other stories. Certain crew members will be more loyal to a kind captain, but a ruthless captain will have more options in dealing with certain situations. All of this forms a gameplay loop where traits act sometimes as stats, sometimes as meters, and sometimes as expendable resources. Traits are inherently transparent to the player. All of those state changes are explicit. So there's a design contract in Voyageur. At no point is the game tracking hidden state. Everything about your character that influences game outcomes is visible to you, even if you don't necessarily know how it influences those outcomes. So, like a physics engine or a parser game world model, this is really a toolbox for building game mechanics. For example, there's a large storyline in the game that involves going on an expedition into an alien and hostile world. All of the mechanics of this are expressed in terms of traits. There's a trait that tracks how deep into the alien landscape you've gone. Going deeper gives you better resources, which are themselves traits, and which can be cashed in for various other resources in other starlets and other planets. So the player is free to pursue free-floating starlets as they wish, assuming they can find the appropriate type of planet, to assemble their own path through the content, which is somewhat randomized and somewhat based on player choice. This plays heavily into the procedural generation, because it allows me to generate planets one at a time without worrying about how they would slot into some overarching narrative. Everything is modular, so the player gets to build their own narrative arcs out of what they find as they go along. This requires a particular style of writing where you're trying to be brief, evocative, and not overly detailed. You want to give the players small morsels of writing to lead them on, but let them fill in the gaps themselves. So to make the procedural content a good backdrop for the narrative and the game design, I have to make sure that both the game's systems and the way I write the narrative fit well with PCG. This is an important point about procedural generation that sometimes gets lost in the broader conversation about it. It needs to be an integral part of the design. You can't substitute authored content with procedural content and expect it to just work out. You have to make sure that the systems and ideas in the game work with procedural content. And that's a bit of an art in itself. If you take one thing away from this, procedural generation needs to be demystified. It has to be taken out of the grimoire and into the toolbox. So, thank you for having me, thanks to Noah Swartz for organizing this. You can find Voyageur on Twitter at VoyageurGame or on our website voyageur.space. Yeah, space is a TLD. And I will be posting some notes for this talk on my personal website, segway.pw/roguelikes. Okay, thank you and good day.